And I'm very, very happy and grateful and thankful that my little studio has actually been visited today by the Minister of Children and for the Prevention of Family and Sexual Violence, Karen Chhour, is with me. Karen, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Leah. It's great to be here.
It's so lovely to have you in my little studio here, which is sadly my camera doesn't quite pan round to you, Karen, but she is here. Look, we are going to have, firstly, but we are going to get to the Military Style Academy and the unveiling of it last weekend, and the 10 boys start their residency on Monday, so the day's almost here. But first I want to talk about the final report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. On Wednesday night, survivors of abuse piled into Parliament's public gallery to hear MPs address the horrors its report contained. Many were crying and hugging one another during the speeches. Now, I saw your speech, Karen, and you were emotional, and many of those that spoke were. For you, growing up in a state system, though, as we've talked about before, did it hit hard for you?
Yeah, and I think it also gives me that extra motivation where I feel like I have to be that strong leader of change in this space, because that's why I stuck my hand up. Because I know that the system doesn't work well in some spaces. But from reading the reports, and as far as I've got right now, because it's such a massive report, I want to take real time to read through that and make sure that I do justice to all the voices that came to the table for that report. But from what I've read so far, whilst the atrocities that happened back then were you couldn't comprehend what's on those papers, and I encourage people, because it is public, to have a good look, because unless we have this discussion, we're likely to repeat the horrors of the past. So I encourage people to just have a read so that we can discuss this very openly. But yeah, it was a very emotional day.
Yeah. How many of the victim statements did you get to read? Because, like you said, it's a very big report, and you have had a look. But in your speech, you said that you had gotten through a few. How much did you read?
Well, I haven't actually counted how many statements I've read, because they're sort of throughout the document. So the document will give you an overview of some of the issues that have happened, and then within the pages they might add in a victim statement or a victim story. It might have their age, where they came from, how they came to be about in that space. And what happened to them when they were there. So the document has those stories entwined throughout it.
But you read a bit. So, I mean, it might sound like a bit of a silly question, but how important is this report?
Oh, so important. I mean, we talk about this has taken a long time. It's taken 6 years. No, I'm sorry. This has taken decades of people's voices not being heard. And so it's quite significant to sit in Parliament and actually hear that acknowledgement. And I really do hope that it gave some of those victims closure. But what we also have to acknowledge is that a lot of these people are quite old now. And many have passed away before they had a chance to hear. They were heard and they were believed. So I think we have to really acknowledge that as well, how many who are not here anymore, and also how many young people actually took their own lives because they couldn't get through the atrocities that were happening to them. So this is more than just about the victim statements on these papers. This is about this nation's shame. And you cannot move forward and you cannot make changes if you don't actually acknowledge that there's a problem. A lot of changes have happened over the years, things that we didn't accept, that we accepted back then, like corporal punishment, no longer happens. But that abuse was way beyond corporal punishment. And my mind still boggles as to how did these people become that way? How did they think that that was okay to treat vulnerable victims, disabled community, and children, and in faith-based care, where actually you would have thought there's quite a high standard when it comes to faith. But no, nobody was safe.
Well, you know, many people in the last couple of days have said, you know, how did this happen? As a society, how did this continue? You said the perpetrators knew society was conditioned not to believe young victims. And I actually thought that was quite, you know, a powerful thing to say, because I was thinking about that too. And that in the time, you know, this was taken from 1950s right through to 2009, around about there. And back then, that was how society was, wasn't it? That
children were seen and not heard.
Correct. And you said that. You said society was conditioned not to believe young victims. And you spoke about the enablers. Can you explain that?
I see an enabler as somebody who sees something and does nothing and just enables that to continue, and also makes excuses for the people who are harming others. There are no excuses, and society is worse off when good people do nothing. And unfortunately, if you're a good person and you do nothing, you're no longer a good person.
Yeah. I mean, this could go as far too when we look at what happens with our young people, with our babies that are getting, you know, beaten and killed, and the people in the house aren't saying anything, you know, the enablers. Karen, do you think children are still being hurt in care?
Oh, yeah, I acknowledge children are still being hurt in care. And I think we have to be very careful about our definition of in care. Because whilst oranga tamariki may have the duty of care of that young person in OT's care, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're with strangers or they've been placed with non-kin family. In care can also mean with whānau, with oversight of oranga tamariki. I think we've just got to be very careful with how we define in care, because what I would say is abuse does not discriminate. Abuse happens everywhere. And whilst we can't eliminate the risk, oranga tamariki can only do as much as they possibly can to put safety measures in place. But we can't completely eliminate risk.